What if the world's greatest genius was never trying to save us, but to prove he was better than the gods we worship? Lex Luthor isn't just Superman's enemy. He is a mirror of human fear, pride, and obsession with control. Behind every invention and every speech lies a single question: how far would a man go to silence the divine? What you're about to uncover may change the way you see intelligence, power, and yourself. Before the world knew his name, Lex Luthor was just a boy from Metropolis' darker corners, a place where ambition was the only light and survival was the only rule. He wasn't born a villain. He was shaped, methodically, in the shadows of skyscrapers that cast long reminders of how small he was. Raised by a cold, calculating father, Lex grew up in an environment where love was conditional and success was demanded. Every test, every question, every failure became a scar. Not visible, but deep, in the fabric of his mind. And from this early age, one truth settled into his bones: weakness was the real enemy. His childhood was filled with silence, broken only by the hum of machines and the cold logic of numbers. While others played, Lex read. While others slept, he calculated, theorized, invented. He excelled in science and technology, not for passion, but as proof. Proof that he could rise above the chaos he was born into. But even as his intellect soared, something inside remained brittle. The young genius was admired, but never loved. Respected, but never trusted. He wasn't bullied for being different. He was ignored for being dangerous. The world around Lex didn't see what was growing in him: the belief that intellect was the ultimate weapon, and that those who had it should rule. His worldview began to form with eerie precision. People, in his eyes, were systems. Emotions were inefficiencies. The human heart was a flaw in the design. You can program a machine to never lie, he once said at age 15, but you can't trust a man with hope. That sentence would echo for decades to come. He wasn't speaking as a boy. He was announcing a philosophy. It was at this stage that the first psychological cracks began to show. His obsession with perfection wasn't about achievement, it was about control. Deep down, Lex feared power he couldn't calculate. The idea that someone, or something, might exist beyond his reach was intolerable. Psychologists might label this a superiority complex rooted in deep-seated inferiority, a coping mechanism for a child who never felt safe. But Lex would never admit to fear. He believed in mastery, in dominance. And he was willing to pay any price for it. As he built his first prototype AI and hacked into government servers, for fun, one question haunted him: what if there really is someone stronger than me? That was the beginning of the war he hadn't yet declared. A war not against Superman, but against the very idea of superiority not earned through intellect. But there was something no one saw coming. A force from the sky. A being of impossible strength. A symbol of hope. And in Lex's mind, a threat to everything he had built his identity upon. To the public, Superman was a miracle. But to Lex, he was a mirror, one that reflected his deepest fear, that intelligence wasn't enough. That brilliance could be overshadowed by something he couldn't replicate, control, or outthink. It wasn't jealousy, it was existential dread. In that instant, Lex's worldview, built over decades of logic and control, began to unravel. How could a man who bled, who studied, who suffered to rise above others, ever compete with someone born perfect? That rupture was subtle at first. Lex smiled on television, shaking Superman's hand, donating millions to hero-related causes. But behind the scenes, his private journals became darker. His language changed. "We cannot depend on a god," he wrote, "when men can build themselves into something better." His laboratories multiplied. So did the experiments. Not to improve humanity, but to protect it from what he believed was a growing dependency on something alien. The internal conflict grew louder. Lex wasn't just angry. He was terrified. If people accepted Superman as their savior, what did that say about free will? About progress? About humanity's place in the universe? His psychological rupture was complete the day he saw a group of children wearing Superman capes and shouting his name. Not Luthor. Superman. That day, he smashed a prototype satellite against a wall and ordered full investment in Kryptonian analysis. Science labels this kind of reaction as displacement and identity crisis. When an individual's internal value system is threatened by a new, uncontrollable reality, the mind will do whatever it can to restore balance, even if that balance is built on destruction. Lex, once a man of logic, was now governed by obsession. Not to destroy Superman, but to prove he was unnecessary. That man could, and should, be enough. The rupture extended outward. LexCorp began investing in artificial enhancement programs, surveillance technology, biological weapons. He framed it all as defense, but every blueprint had a single variable in mind: what does it take to neutralize a god? The board members didn't question it. Investors didn't resist. The world was busy cheering Superman. No one saw what Lex was becoming. And it was in that moment that everything began to crack beyond repair. Not just within Lex, but within the very structure of human confidence. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was precise, engineered like one of Lex's machines. He didn't raise his voice or wear a mask. He wore tailored suits, smiled in interviews, and shook hands with presidents. But beneath that polished exterior, a storm was organizing itself. Lex Luthor's descent wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Step by step, belief by belief, he reshaped his purpose, not to destroy Superman, but to dismantle the idea of him. At first, he cloaked his intentions under science. He launched space surveillance systems, for planetary defense. He created genetically modified organisms, to enhance medical resilience. He funded AI development, for human assistance. But every project carried the same hidden goal: discovering Superman's weaknesses, replicating his powers, and building systems that could replace him. It was a calculated descent into a darker logic, one where hope was no longer seen as a virtue, but a risk. Lex began to speak in symbols. When humans bow to miracles, they stop building rockets. We should not kneel before power. We should dismantle it, study it, and outgrow it. These weren't just provocations. They were seeds. The kind that find their way into the minds of those who already feel small, forgotten, or powerless. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just fighting Superman. He was building an ideology, one where mankind was supreme and divinity was irrelevant. Inside his mind, the world was divided into variables. Emotions were equations. Morality was a calculation of outcomes. Psychologists would call this cold cognition, an intense form of reasoning detached from empathy, where decisions are based solely on logic and control. In Lex's worldview, compassion became dangerous because it introduced uncertainty. Love, trust, forgiveness, these were threats to systems. And systems, he believed, must be clean, precise, and absolute. To understand Lex Luthor is to walk through a mind designed like a laboratory. Nothing is left to chance. Every thought is compartmentalized. Every action, rehearsed. He once said, "People don't fear chaos. They fear being powerless in it." And so he gave people structure, answers, control. But at a cost, the erasure of anything unexplained, anything unearned. Including Superman. Then came the moment no one expected. Lex created something, someone, who could match Superman. Not by birth, but by design. A synthetic being, shaped not from love or chance, but from calculations and algorithms. This wasn't just science. It was declaration. Lex had taken the next step in his evolution. He was no longer trying to understand the divine. He was trying to replace it. But the real monster hadn't yet awakened. Because in building a world without gods, Lex was becoming something else, something far colder than a villain. A symbol of what happens when genius loses all fear of consequence. It didn't happen in a grand explosion or televised catastrophe. It happened quietly, in a boardroom, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by men in suits. That was the day Lex Luthor gave the final approval to an operation designed to neutralize Superman. Not physically, yet, but socially. Deconstruct the myth, he ordered. Strip away the illusion. It was the moment he crossed the invisible line from challenger to architect of downfall. The point of no return had arrived. Lex had learned something chilling, that the world didn't need to witness Superman fall from the sky. It just needed to doubt him. And doubt, he realized, spreads faster than truth. So he seeded stories. Whispered questions in political ears. Planted footage, harmless at first, but edited. Out of context heroics twisted into paranoia. Why was he really at that scene? What does he decide not to save? The media followed the bait. The public wavered. Lex never lifted a hand. He didn't need to. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about ideology. Lex had fully embraced a philosophy where the ends justified the means. Ethics became numbers. Public fear, a tool. Morality, a narrative to be shaped. He spoke to world leaders not with threats, but with logic. Would you let a foreign power patrol your skies unchecked? Then why tolerate this alien? He didn't need to attack Superman. He made others want to. The shift in Lex's mind was now irreversible. Empathy became inefficiency. Cooperation, a form of weakness. He believed he was freeing humanity from dependence, but in truth, he was severing their access to wonder. This is what psychologists refer to as moral disengagement, when a person distances themselves from the ethical weight of their actions through justification. I'm not harming him, Lex would say. I'm protecting humanity from psychological decay. Behind the scenes, he activated contingency plans. Defense systems with artificial intelligence, coded with fail-safes against Kryptonian physiology. He financed think tanks with one mission, to redefine the concept of a hero, not as someone who saves lives, but as someone who builds systems that make saving lives unnecessary. It sounded noble. But at its core, it was erasure. The erasure of all. Lex wasn't just at war with Superman. He was at war with the idea that anything could exist beyond human control. His transformation was now complete. He no longer saw himself as a villain or even a man. He was a safeguard. A firewall against belief. And in his mind, belief was the real threat. And if that's true, then what if he was right? What if Lex Luthor, cold and calculating, was the last line between humanity and surrendering to something it could never truly understand? What if the villain was the only one still awake? To most, Lex Luthor looked like a man who had lost his way. But inside his mind, everything made perfect sense. Every scheme, every deception, every sleepless night spent dissecting alien biology or designing countermeasures wasn't madness, it was a system. A grand formula. And if anyone dared look closely, they'd see that Lex wasn't building chaos. He was following the logic of survival. Neuroscientists have a term for this kind of thinking, hyperrationalization. A psychological state where emotion is replaced by obsessive reasoning. People in this state can justify anything if it fits the equation. That was Lex. He saw a world hypnotized by a symbol in a cape, one powerful enough to turn human achievement into background noise. To him, Superman wasn't a savior. He was a distraction, a divine ceiling over the human race. And Lex refused to kneel. With billions in research grants under shell companies, he secretly funded fields considered fringe by the mainstream: gravitational manipulation, red sun radiation, xenogenetic sequencing. None of it was for power. It was for balance. His balance. Because if Superman existed, then Lex's vision of human supremacy did not. And that contradiction had to be corrected. Not emotionally, scientifically. He wrote white papers under aliases, warning of dependency on external forces. He cited historical parallels, civilizations that collapsed when they put faith in figures instead of systems. Rome and Caesar. Germany and charisma. Earth and Superman. In lectures to his inner circle, he often quoted Enlightenment thinkers. If man is to be free, he must be ruled by reason, not reverence. And his version of reason was absolute. Psychologists might diagnose Lex with grandiose delusions, but it's more accurate to say he suffered from a philosophical addiction. The belief that he alone could see the full picture. He began to test the boundaries of ethics in controlled environments, artificial life forms, memory alteration trials, thought conditioning programs. All under the guise of human advancement. Yet each step brought him closer to what he claimed to oppose, control through fear. He no longer reacted to Superman. He anticipated him. He built predictive models, entire simulations to forecast how the world would react if Superman disappeared. Would war return? Would governments collapse? According to Lex's data, yes. And that, to him, was the final proof. Superman wasn't a hero. He was a psychological crutch. A dependency. An illusion of peace. And when Lex stood before a secret council of world powers, unrecorded, off the books, he posed the question without a hint of emotion: what happens when he decides we are not worth saving? The silence that followed was his answer. It wasn't madness. It was cold calculation. And in that calculation, Lex Luthor became something far more dangerous than a villain. He became necessary. When the dust settled, there was no crater, no smoking battlefield, just questions. No one could say when exactly Lex Luthor won, or if he ever truly did. Superman was still in the sky. Cities still stood. But the world had changed. Trust had thinned. Awe had dimmed. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Earth's highest offices, people whispered Lex's warnings, replayed his data, and began to wonder, what if he was right all along? Luthor's legacy wasn't built from victory. It was built from doubt. From the subtle reshaping of public perception until the myth of the perfect hero cracked. People still looked up at Superman, but now with hesitation. Lex had injected a virus into the world's belief system, the idea that no being, no matter how noble, should be above question. And once that seed was planted, it spread. Silently. Permanently. He never needed to destroy Superman. All he had to do was rewrite what he meant. Sociologists call this cultural reframing. A shift in collective interpretation. What once symbolized hope now symbolized dependence. Where once people saw safety, they now saw surveillance. And Lex made sure to offer a solution: humanity must outgrow its need for guardians. That was his creed, etched not in stone, but in policy, algorithms, defense networks, and cold logic. His actions left scars, not only in the world's psyche but in its systems. Governments became more secretive. Surveillance increased. Independence movements flourished. In this new world, strength was no longer defined by power, but by control, of information, of perception, of reality. And though few would speak his name aloud, Lex's influence pulsed behind every regulation, every technological advancement aimed at keeping power earthbound. In interviews, political analysts often said, he was a villain who won without winning. But philosophers offered a more unsettling idea. That Lex Luthor didn't fight Superman to destroy him. He fought to define him. And by doing so, defined us all. Because Lex forced the world to look in the mirror and ask, if given a choice between a perfect savior and flawed freedom, what would we choose? And the answer, quietly, devastatingly, was freedom, no matter the cost. Even in exile, Lex's ideas echoed through think tanks, university debates, and late-night broadcasts. He had become more than a man. He had become a framework. A worldview. One that insisted that to be truly human was to reject worship, embrace reason, and challenge even the stars. But maybe, he wasn't the last. Somewhere out there, a child watches the skies and sees not hope, but threat. Not wonder, but warning. And perhaps, like Lex once did, that child will begin to question, and build. And when they do, a new cycle will begin. Because myths may fade, but doubt never dies. In a small classroom nestled in the heart of Metropolis, a boy stared out the window as the others recited history. But he wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on a red and blue blur that streaked silently across the sky. His classmates clapped. His teacher smiled. But the boy frowned. He had read everything. The reports, the old speeches, the redacted files. He'd downloaded the LexCorp archives from the dark net, decrypted the files one by one. At night, while the world dreamed of heroes, he studied why people needed them. And the more he read, the more he questioned the narrative he'd been fed. Was strength supposed to be trusted just because it smiled? The boy had no name worth mentioning, not yet. But his thoughts were sharp, and his world was getting smaller. He saw how adults whispered when the sky cracked open with sonic thunder. He noticed how quickly they silenced anyone who asked too many questions. And in that silence, he began to hear Lex Luthor's voice, not literally, but ideologically. He found comfort not in capes, but in equations. Not in symbols, but in systems. His notebooks were filled not with drawings of heroes, but flowcharts of dependency, surveillance loops, and psychological thresholds. He began to map the line between admiration and submission, between protection and control. And every map led back to one terrifying conclusion: the world hadn't evolved. It had only changed costumes. From a psychological standpoint, what was happening inside the boy's mind is known as inherited skepticism, when trauma, distrust, or radical thought is absorbed generationally, often without direct contact. He had never met Lex Luthor. But the imprint of Luthor's logic lived on in him like a dormant gene. One day, during a routine school essay titled, "What Does Superman Mean to You?" the boy turned in a single page. Superman is a limit we've accepted because we fear what we could become without one. The teacher marked it incomplete. The principal called his parents. But he didn't care. Because he had already begun. Hidden under his bed, beneath the boards, was a device. Not a weapon. A prototype. Something Lex had once dreamed of but never completed. The boy was perfecting it. Not to destroy. Not to conquer. To test. To test whether humanity had grown since the age of heroes. Or merely surrendered with a smile. The cycle was turning. Not with fire or noise, but with quiet, analytical intent. A boy who had never felt inspired by the skies, only challenged by them. And in the final pages of his journal, one sentence stood alone, maybe the first was called Lex. But I will be the last.